بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So inshallah in today's lecture we are going to talk about التفسير الفقهي, the tafsir that is based on a fiqh approach. That means understanding the ahkam, the rulings of the various verses of the Sharia. And the author is going to give us two examples that we will look at, and we will also highlight some of the important features of this approach. I mean, he's going to give us two examples. Of course, there are many other examples out there. And then we will move into chapter 11, and we will look at the modern tafsirs, which is, he doesn't have a lot of positive things to say about modern tafsirs because they have a lot of deficiencies. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's deficient in them, and then maybe some aspects of some modern tafsir that might be useful and might be important. But the point is that the modern tafsir are just so fundamentally different than the traditional approach of the tafsir that it's no wonder that people would have a lot of critique about them. He'll give some examples, but I'm more interested in the styles of the modern tafsir. People that do tafsir by science, people do tafsir about social sciences, people that are looking at philosophical aspects. Those are the type of topics that you will find in the quote-unquote modern tafsir. I mean, the upshot really is that there's no modern tafsir. That's the problem, is that nobody's really done a comprehensive, just continue the genre or the issue of the tafsir. And then lastly, we will look at chapter 12, and we will look at the translation of the Quran. This is begins sort of as a fiqh issue. Can you translate the Quran? What does that mean, translating the Quran? And then, therefore, accepting the possibility of the translation of the meanings of the Quran, what are the rules that one has to look out for in to be able to translate the Quran effectively, which is of course a huge amana. The Quran has been translated into dozens and dozens of languages. So this is probably, for us, conducting this course in the English language is probably one of the most important discussions. That's the game plan. I'll see you back here, inshallah, for the beginning of our discussion. All right, so chapter 10, Fiqh Tafsir. So we've looked at the different types of tafsir, and this is one of those areas that's very important and highly significant, which is the ulama that look at the various verses of the Quran, trying to deduce rulings either to support their madhab or to deduce rulings in general, to try to analyze the text of the Quran as how they impact certain Sharia rulings. One of the aspects of this type of tafsir is that the fiqhi tafsir tends to be much more deep and rich in the discussion than some of the other tafsir. If you look at, we started with talking about tafsir al-ma'thur, the tafsirs based on just narrating the traditions. There's not much an analysis in that. There's just, okay, this verse or this set of verses, let me gather all of the traditions about them, whether they be sound traditions or Isra'iliyat or whatever, but I'm going to gather them all. Sometimes the ulama did talk about the veracity of the traditions and what they mean. I mean, I'm not saying that they didn't, but it's sort of a collecting and gathering effort, much more than it is an analytical effort. The tafsir bil-ra'i, the ijtihadi approach, that is an analytical level. And most certainly when we come to fiqhi tafsir, very depth, very deep discussion and nuance in understanding the text of the Quran. Oftentimes they will talk about the different madhahib, the different schools of thought, the different opinions about a certain issue, whether it be in one madhab or be in multiple madhabs. And then, of course, they're going to have to pick an opinion and side with an opinion despite the plurality of interpretive possibilities. One of the famous examples that goes back to the time of the Sahaba is the verse in Baqarah, وَالْمُطَلِّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوء, that the pregnant women the women who are divorced, their waiting period is ثلاثة قروء. Al-qar', 3 qar'. Is a menstrual cycle or a pure cycle? It means both things in the Arabic language. So the Salaf, the Sahaba, had to take it upon themselves to choose one over another, to choose one meaning over another, to give preference to one meaning over another. So this is an example of a tafsir, of fiqhi tafsir, where we're going to have to pick a side, and we're going to have to prove why we pick a side. Why am I going to say that the qar' means a menstrual cycle, or why am I going to say that the qar' means a pure cycle? And we're going to have to debate that, talking about language, talking about precedent, so on and so forth. Now, as the Islamic schools of thought became codified around the 3rd Islamic century and beyond, this type of tafsir became quite popular, because many people would engage in the tafsir to show the proofs of their madhab on these certain issues, legal issues. So he gives for us 2 examples. The first is the tafsir of Al-Jassas, who is Abu Bakr Ahmed ibn Ali al-Razi, his popular name is Al-Jassas. He was born in the year 305 and he died in 370. He was a Hanafi in Baghdad, and this book this tafsir rather, is a very strong effort to demonstrate the truth of, or the veracity, I should say, I don't want to say truth, but the veracity of the Hanafi legal positions when it comes to the verses of the ahkam. Another feature of the tafsir, of the Jassas's tafsir, is he doesn't simply analyze the specific legal issue at hand, but he will also do istitrad, which is to, okay, from this point we can mention a couple of other points tangentially that are important and related to the primary discussion. So he does that a lot in his tafsir, and therefore brings out from the discussion a rich plethora of legal points. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. He has the verse, for example, فَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا فَوَاحِدَةً أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ ذَلِكَ أَدْنَى أَلَّا تَعُولُوا. The verse that talks about polygamy. أَلَّا تَعُولُوا, the end of the verse, most of the mufassirun say, so that you do not incline towards one wife or over another. Imam Shafi'i understood that verse as to not have many children. Al-Jassas responds to Shafi'i's tafsir, saying that this is a mistake linguistically, because if the verse had to do with children, it would be أَلَّا تُعِيلُوا, not أَلَّا تُعُولُوا. So, عيال عيلوا. So this is a small example of how he would take a legal issue from the verse and give nusrat, give victory or preference to his madhab, the Hanafi madhab, over the other madhab. The second tafsir is Al-Qurtubi's tafsir. And Al-Qurtubi died in the year 671. He is Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Abi Bakr ibn Farah al-Ansari al-Khazraji al-Andalusi al-Qurtubi. So he was from Cordoba, and then he made his way to Egypt, where he lived for the rest of his life and died. Again, very rich hadith and very balanced. So, for example, when he discusses the word فَغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ, to wash your face in the wudu. Now, in the Maliki madhab, one of the conditions for the wudu is what we call a delk, is to massage. So, if I put the water on my face, I have to rub my fingers around my face like that to massage the water in. In the Shafi'i madhab is if we just took water and we poured it over our face, that would fulfill al-ghasl. So Al-Qurtubi actually analyzes this part of the word فَغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ and says, it gives examples that if you dunked your head in water or something like that, then that would fulfill the linguistic meaning of ghasl, and therefore it is permissible. So in this case, he gave preference to a non-Maliki position, because he was a Maliki, he came from Andalusia. He gave preference to to a non-Maliki position of the Maliki position in his fair assessment and understanding of the tafsir. He also brings about a lot of nuanced discussions that, because of his analyzing the verses of the ahkam and trying to show the veracity of interpretations, he brings new understandings that are not necessarily there. So, for example, فَمَسْتَمْتَعْتُمْ بِهِ مِنْهُنَّ فَأَتُوهُنَّ أُجُورَهُنَّ فَرِيضَةً. For those who you've had sexual relations with, then it becomes incumbent upon you to pay the mahr prayer. And then he says, وَهَذَا دَلِيلٌ عَلَى أَنَّهُ أَيَ الْمَهْرِ فِي مُقَابَلَةِ الْبُضْعِ. He said, and this is a proof that the mahr is in exchange for sexual rights with the wife, which sounds crass when you're saying it, but his point is why do you pay the mahr? Because if you don't have sexual intercourse and there's a divorce, you're going to return the mahr or return half the mahr, etc. So he's saying the reason it becomes obligatory is that this is a proof, therefore, that there's a coupling between the two, the giving of the mahr and the sexual act. So you'll find a lot of this kind of stuff in Al-Qurtubi's tafsir, which is very, very rich, like Al-Jassas's, but has his own flavor, has the Qurtubi flavor to things. Okay, that's enough for that chapter. I'll pick up the next chapter in the next clip, inshallah, bi'idhnillah. Okay, chapter 11, modern tafsir. Newsflash, the Shaykh does not like the modern tafsirs, and I'm with him on that, because there's a lot of nonsense. There's a lot of nonsense because of the great intellectual tribulation that has gone through the Muslim world over the last 150, 200 years. Perhaps one of the best resources that I highly, highly, highly recommend that you acquire and that you learn to read is Mustafa Sabri's Mawqif al-Aql wal-Ilm, which is a 4-volume book written by the last Shaykh al-Islam of the Ottoman Empire, Mustafa Sabri, rahimahullah. And his first volume of the book, he explains all of the kind of things that we're going to talk about right now in this clip, which is the great fitna that happened in the early 20th century, in which a lot of people started to negate the existence of miracles, negate the creation of Adam alayhi salam, negate certain things that they didn't feel were at that time scientifically compatible with the science of that time. So going back like Noah's flood or Watayran Ababil, all of those stories, the stories of the miracles that we have, is to do away with them and explain them away. There were a huge fitna of not believing in the return of Isa alayhi salam. And this has a lot to do with the rise of materialism, colonialism, attack on traditional Islamic learning, the great disparity between the majority Muslim world technologically and industrially with Europe at the time, and therefore assuming that the quote-unquote backwardness of the Muslim world had to do with that we are holding on to these nonsensical beliefs. That basically is what was happening. I mean, obviously that's nonsense. It's not true. The technological and industrial backwardness of the Muslim world has nothing to do with that. It has to do with geopolitics and economics. But anyway, that was things that were posited, and then therefore that bled into efforts to do tafsir of the Quran. So you do have people that would do tafsir of the Quran, and there's no need to mention the names, but just so be look on the lookout for these type of themes in which people would, you know, critique miracles and stories of the prophets. A huge attack on the Isra and the Ma'raj, something so fundamental, right? We have a whole surah in the Quran, Surah Al-Ma'raj, and saying no, it wasn't an actual traveling. It was something that the Prophet ﷺ saw in his dreams, and all that nonsense that comes out around this period. And then you will find that in the tafsir to reform and to rechange the primary understanding that we have on these issues. Now, one type of tafsir that you have is what they call a tafsir al-manhaji, which is like a methodological approach in which each verse has the same analysis of asbab al-nuzul. This is what the words mean. This is the i'rab of the sentence. This is the balagh of the sentence. This is the relationship of the verse before it to the verse after it. And these type of tafsirs tend to be very simple to read. Now, the stuff that I'm about to say, some of it's hit or miss. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good. So I don't want to necessarily give you names of tafsir, but I want you to understand the concepts of these type of approaches to tafsir. The second tafsir is sort of a social science tafsir. And it looks at the Quran as a piece of literature, not as revelation, which obviously is a very incorrect perspective. If you're going to approach the entire Quran as if it was not revelation, then I'm sorry, but then it's not tafsir anymore. It's something else. That's what we did in the Western Academy. When I was at Princeton, they looked at the Quran and the Hadith in those tradition. But those people weren't Muslims, so it wasn't a big deal for me. But when Muslims start doing that, that's a problem, because the basic premise that the Quran is revelation, and we talked about revelation in the early classes, is violated. So if it's not revelation and you think it's a piece of literature, it's a book of history, then you're gonna employ tools of critical critique, of historical critique, literary critique to the Quran, which is not appropriate because that's not the type of book the Quran is. A third type of tafsir are scientific tafsir, tafsir al-ilmi, which is personally I find the oddest. And the reason it's odd is that our understanding of the material world is only current with what we know now. But what we know now is subject to change, what we sort of discover and how we articulate and explain things tomorrow. So if I want to explain the Quran based on what I know now of the material world, of the physical world, of the science that I have now, it's going to be a very limited tafsir, because I might find things in the Quran that are contradictory to what I believe in now scientifically, or are inexplicable scientifically. But if I waited a generation, then there would be new theories that would explain those things. So these type of tafsir tend to cut down the discussion of miracles and attack miracles as they appear, and that's obviously highly problematic. Another type of tafsir is a general tafsir, a tafsir al-am, and this is what's probably most popular with a lot of people, which is a very simple, tafsir for people in a rush, or for tafsir for people on the go. And this tends to be a tafsir that is macro, not micro. So it will talk about themes, concepts, general interpretation of verses, but it would rarely get into the details. And because it's just broad, you will find that these types of tafsir are the tafsirs that are common with preachers, public figures, people in the public space, in which there's no patience for a nuanced understanding or in-depth understanding, they will tend to go to these type of tafsir. And then lastly, the fifth type of tafsir that the Shaykh talks about is tafsir al-mawdu'i, which is a thematic tafsir of the Quran. I find this to be useful. So you will find like Al-Ghazali, Muhammad Al-Ghazali, not Abu Hamid of the Salaf, but the modern Muhammad Al-Ghazali. He has a tafsir al-mawdu'i of the Quran, in which he'll talk about the major themes of every surah, and in that linking the theme of the surah to the surah before it and to the surah after it. That is useful. There's a lot of benefit in that, because why is Surah Al-Baqarah called Surah Al-Baqarah? Even though it's one small story, so that's obviously from a thematic point of view a significant part of the story. And by the way, not all of the surahs have each surah has multiple names, so it could be called something else. We have accepted the Baqarah as the main name and we've published it that way, the Mus'haf, but there could be other names. So what is the theme of the Baqarah as it relates to the other verses of Surah Al-Baqarah? Other verses in Surah Al-Baqarah. Can we then therefore come up with a theme? Al-Baqarah is talking about this, Al-Imran is talking about that, At-Tawbah is talking about this. I mean, Surah Yusuf is an easy one. Surah Yusuf is talking about the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. So there's a theme to it. So the thematic one is one of the things that I think is very important as an addition. I'm not saying it is instead of tafsir. I'm saying it's an interesting thing in addition to the tafsir. So if I'm looking something up in Al-Razi, I would like to step back and look at the Mawdu'i tafsir and be like, well, what's the theme of these verses, so that when I go back to look at the micro tafsir, I can kind of benefit. So these are some of the styles of the tafsir that we have in the modern world. Some of them are a complete miss. Like, I think the scientific thing is just flawed from the beginning because its fundamental premise is flawed. And some of it's useful, like the thematic tafsir, and some of it is just light. I would describe it as just being light. It's not very heavy. It's not very detail oriented. If you want to do tafsir, the tafsir has to be deep. It can't be superficial. Otherwise, it's not tafsir. This is a very, very deep subject matter, a very, very deep discipline that requires many tools in your toolkit to be able to effectively do it, as we've mentioned in some of the previous lectures. Okay, that's enough on chapter 11. The next chapter will be chapter 12, which will talk about the translation of the Quran and some of the interesting things that come from that. I'll see you back for the next clip, inshallah. All right, chapter 12, the translation of the Quran. What do we mean, first of all, by the translation of the Quran? One can mean by that is to translate the actual Quran literally into another language. That is impossible, because the Quran is a revelation, and the revelation of the Quran is only in the Arabic language. So I can't create an English Quran and say this is the Quran, and that's a literal translation of the Quran. That I can't do. But when I say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and I translate it as in the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, I am translating some of the meanings of that verse of the Quran. So if we mean that the translation is a translation of the meanings of the Quran, that's permissible, because basically it's a form of tafsir, right? That's what the tafsir are. Even if it's an Arabic tafsir, Urdu tafsir, Persian tafsir, it is trying to capture and explain the meanings of the verses. So I can't take my English Quran and stand in prayer and pray with it. So that's the first thing, is we need to understand what we mean by that. The issue of Tarjamatul Quran, and again, I'm reminded of Shaykh al-Islam Mustafa Sabri, who has a book called Mas'alat Tarjamatul Quran, which is an excellent book about this controversy that happened in Turkey towards the end of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and through its collapse and the rise of the modern Turkish state, republic. There was this issue of translating the Quran, but what he was talking about is he was talking about translating the Quran and using the translation of the Quran for liturgical purposes in the prayer. So if you read the book by Mustafa Sabri, I don't want you to think when he criticizes the translation of the Quran, he's saying that you can't translate the Quran. He's talking about the first type of translation that I mentioned that you can't have. Just as an aside, in the Hanafi madhab, there is a dispensation for somebody who does not, a new Muslim just converted, doesn't know anything of Islam. They could read the prayer, a translation of the Fatiha in the prayer until they were able to get the Arabic done. But even in that opinion, which is its own like unique, the other madhabs don't take it, still it's only like a temporary opinion because the person's got to know the Arabic of the Fatiha to be able to recite the prayer in. Okay, so when we're talking about tafsir, when we're talking about translation of the Quran, we're talking about translating the meanings of the Quran. We're not talking about translating the Quran into another language and using that language for liturgical purposes. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing I want to say about that is that the Quran has been translated, for better or for worse, ever since the 15th century. I think the first Latin translation in the Quran appeared some time in the mid 1400s, I think, or early 1500s. So that's like Pandora's box. I mean, once that happened, it's only a matter of time in which the Quran will be translated, for better or for worse. I mean, I'm not saying these translations were good, for better or for worse, into other languages. And now it's almost impossible to conceive of us not having the Quran in all these languages. So there are hundreds and hundreds of translations of the Quran in dozens and dozens of languages. So this is a fact, and there's nothing wrong with it as long as the translation is accurate. So for you to be able to do the translation of the Quran, you are doubly tasked because you need to know the original language of the Quran, the Arabic of the Quran. You have to understand the grammatical structure, the syntax. You have to understand the balagha, the rhetoric of the Quran, the asbab al-nuzul, so on and so forth. So that when you come to render it, some of the meanings in English, and let's just go with English as in this case, it has to be in compatibility with the original meanings. For example, وَهُوَ أَنْشَأَكُم مِّنَ الْأَرْضِ وَاسْتَعْمَرَكُمْ فِيهَا. Allah Ta'ala has caused you to be created from the matter of the earth. وَاسْتَعْمَرَكُمْ فِيهَا, has asked of you that you developed earth. Istamara is istafala. Istafala means to ask of the other person. So when Allah Ta'ala says to us, وَاسْتَعْمَرَكُمْ فِيهَا, He has asked, طَلَبَ مِنَّا عِمَارَهَا. So you have to know that that's what istamara means. It means it's on the wazn of istafala. So you have to understand that to be able to render the translation correctly. I think almost all of the English translations, not all, I'm not going to say all, many of the English translations of the Quran that I've consulted with, and I usually use that verse as a litmus test, don't translate it that way. They talk about it in another way. It doesn't mean that those it doesn't mean that those translations are necessarily wrong, but they have not captured something that is quintessentially part of the prima facie understanding of the word in the Quranic text. So if you want to do the translation of the Quran, go for it, but you need to have requisite knowledge of that. The other thing you need to know about the translation of the Quran is that unfortunately, many nefarious people have translated the Quran. So you have a lot of Christian missionaries that try to translate the Quran. You have a lot of sects within Islam. So a lot of Ahmadis, Qadianis will translate the Quran. There will be Shia that translate the Quran, as there will be Sunnis that translate the Quran. So it's important to also understand what is the person who's translating's aqidah, because the aqidah of the person will reflect in how the book is translated. So therefore, you need to make sure that especially when you come into tricky areas, theological areas, if you have a person who is trying to push a certain agenda that's not the normative Sunni agenda, which is the majority of Islam are Islam, the normative Sunni Islam, things are going to be skewed. And that has been a problem with a lot of translations. Unfortunately, there has been a lot of battles, theological, evangelical battles are taking place through the issue or the act of translating the meanings of the Quran. So that's something you have to be on the lookout for. So unfortunately, it's not like I'm just going to pick up the translation and khalas, I'm done. No. You have to know who the is translating it. Alhamdulillah, within our family of institutions that we have in Jordan, we have altafsir.com, altafsir.com. Altafsir.com is also an app, the Great Tafsirs app, and we have uploaded as many of the English translations that are reliable as possible. Some of them are from Orientalists and some of them are from Muslim authors, for you to be able to easily, not just in English language by the way, but multiple languages. So that's a resource for everybody. As far as the tafsir, I keep saying the word tafsir. As far as the translation of the Quran, what is its hukum? What's the ruling of the Quran? Well, we have to translate the Quran because not most Muslims are not Arab, are not Arabic speaking. Arabs are just a small minority. So it's something that we have to do to be able to cater to the broadest segment of our community. But the translation of the Quran is like a tafsir. It is not something that you can use in prayer for liturgical purposes. So I just want to double down on that and make that point extremely clear to everybody so nobody emerges with a false understanding. Another thing I want to say as we wrap up this chapter on the tafsir, on the translation, is that the translator also has to understand that not everything in the Quran is literal, that there is metaphorical usage of the words, like the things that we've been talking about in usul al-fiqh. So the person that translates needs to be equipped to be able to render meanings in its metaphorical manifestation or its literal manifestation in the foreign language, or in this case in English. So that's also important as a from a point of view of understanding the text of the Quran. You're not always going to translate, it's not going to be a literal translation. You're going to translate the meaning of it. And that's also important because the translator then has to make a choice. Am I going to translate it literally, and then the reader will know that this is a metaphoric usage, or will I translate it to show that it's a metaphorical usage? It depends. There are different styles. And that's why some tafsirs go this way, and some translations go this way, and some translations go that way. So it's something that there'll be a little bit of subjectiveness to it, of how the translator chooses to go with their translation. But it has to be based on a correct reading and a correct, whatever that ends up becoming the translation, that has to be accurate in some orthodox sense from the meaning of the verse. And the verse has to be able to correctly have been interpreted that and carry that meaning, even if it's only one type of meaning or one aspect of meaning or one side of meaning. That part is also important to mention. Okay, so the translations is something that we're going to come across frequently, without doubt, because we're doing this in the English language. I hope that that's clear. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, in today's lecture, we began with chapter 10, talking about the tafsir of fiqh, tafsirs that take a fiqh approach. And we looked at al-Jassas's and we looked at al-Qurtubi's, and we learned that this is kind of related to the rise of the madhahib of fiqh in the 3rd Islamic century. And a lot of these tafsir of fiqh are earlier works because they are used within the madhab structure to show how the madhab, according to its usul, opines on certain verses of the ahkam. Following that, we looked at chapter 11, and we looked at modern tafsir, and we learned about some of the challenges and the problems in the modern tafsir based on some of the false and incorrect beliefs and ideas that people have had over time, primarily material ideas, denying miracles, denying the origin story of Adam, denying the Isra and the Mi'raj, so on and so forth. The list goes on and on and on. I referenced Mustafa Sabri, the last Shaykh al-Islam of the Ottoman Empire, who wrote a book, Mawqif al-Aql wal-Ilm min Rabbil Alameen wa Ibadihi as-Salihin. I think that's the full name of it. I think so. And he talks in the first volume about a lot of these thought trends in the early 20th century. A lot of those thought trends seeped their way into modern tafsir. I gave you a list about 4 types of tafsir, styles of modern tafsir: scientific, social sciences, general, method, thematic, so on and so forth, and talking about some of them are amiss, I gotta say, but some of them, like the thematic tafsir, I think there's a lot of benefit of use into it. But there has been no real modern attempt at a real tafsir. And then chapter 12, we talked about the translation of the Quran, how we mean not translating the literal meaning of the Quran to use that in prayer, because that would be impermissible. But we did talk about the translation of the meanings of the Quran, in which case the translation would essentially be seen as a tafsir. And then we talked about some of the challenges in the translation of the Quran and how one has to be duly fluent in both languages, and one's aqidah has to be clear from any bias, because unfortunately there are a lot of battles that take place in the act of translation to sway people this way or that way. These are the main things that we talked about. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.